Hello, everybody. Welcome to our Michigan State site host. You'll notice we're here with our beautiful Sparty background. We're so excited to welcome you to MSU virtually for the Esports Research Network Conference 2025, sponsored by Corsair for Business. And we're really excited to bring you our afternoon slate of presenters, starting with a series of presenters who are near and dear to my heart, as it's my lab, presented by my colleague, Maxwell Foxman. So we will get Maxwell up here a little bit early, but that's not a bad thing. All right, welcome, Max, our first presenter from the MSU site. If you'd like to share your slides.
Yes, I do. Let me
All
get
right,
my
excellent.
slides up and going here.
We hear you, so you're good to go.
Mm, Just doing some slide adjustments and I'll be good to go.
All right, looks great. Max, make sure your chat is visible. We'll give you a warning when you've got 5 minutes left, cut you off at the end of your 20 minutes of allotted time, and then we will move to Q&A. We'll bring questions over from the Twitch chat and put them either in the Zoom chat or read them out to you when your time's over.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, and I really appreciate being here. This is exciting to be part of a ERN and a 24-hour virtual conference. Just pull up my notes here. There we go. All right, I'm truly good to go now. All right. So yeah, thank you so much for having me, and I look forward to presenting this on behalf of myself and my colleagues, including Amanda, who is hosting this. Do, 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 do. There we go. So to briefly introduce myself, I'm Max Foxman. I'm one of the co-directors, along with Amanda Cote, of the Esports and Games Research Lab. This is a consortium of scholars from across the United States who study college-level gaming and esports. I actually put up these photos, and you can, if you'd like, go to eagerlab.uoregon.edu to check out more about our lab. But you'll notice that on our on our homepage, we'll have pictures of immersive media. And even though that isn't necessarily our prime focus, you see some of the articles that we've written in the lower right-hand corner. This is something that we've always had a relationship to, at least spatially, if not in terms of subject matter. But speaking of not a main focus, I thought in order to contextualize what I'm talking about today, I would start with this example. Even though VR and gaming is in the news, you might have noticed that Valve and Steam have actually just announced a new headset. For those who might remember a few years ago, almost 10, during the real height of the VR hype cycle with Valve, there was this moment where the company released an add-on to Dota 2 known as the Dota VR Hub, and you could basically see how it worked in the video there. It was something that was made primarily for 2D spectating. You would watch a game, and as you were watching, you'd get those sort of 3D uh, views of avatars that were playing. You would get statistics in terms of the game, and then you could actually see where they were located on the playing field. We'll get into that experience more in a second, but at the time it actually received 2016 really great reviews. And even years later, 4 years later, after the project had ostensibly ceased to exist, um, there were still people begging on community forums like Reddit to bring it back. So it speaks to, at least for me, that there was real enthusiasm by the audience at the time for seeing what VR could do in esports. And so that's what my talk today is basically going to be about. I'm going to first lay out a little bit of what I think are the stakes when considering the opportunities and challenges that comes with VR and esports. Then I'll present some examples of VR and how it's, to be absolutely honest, haphazardly been integrated into both popular and niche competitive gaming. And then I'll share some findings from an experiment we've been running regarding VR spectatorship, and then finish by talking about some implications from these findings. And when we're talking about esports, what I'm really talking about, if people want to get nitpicky, is really the introduction of hardware and specifically head-mounted displays or HMDs and specialized controllers that comes into gaming. There's quite a few different ways this may manifest, though, and I could go into some more details about that in the Q&A. In terms of impact, I see three main ways that we can consider how VR integrates into esports. The first is VR-based gaming. The second is thinking about particular opportunities afforded by the hardware I just mentioned. And then finally, thinking about this less from the athlete point of view and more from audience or spectator viewpoints. So I'm going to go through each of these in a little bit more detail. So since that wave of commercial headsets that started really in 2015, 2016, there's been a somewhat consistent move to incorporate some level of competitive gaming into VR and I guess VR into competitive gaming. Particularly, there have been because there are opportunities for multiplayer play and some popular genres like first-person shooters really transfer over to VR quite well. There are full leagues for VR, such as the VR Masters League, which have operated for about 5 years. But given that VR commercial devices haven't, taken off and have relatively low popularity, these tend to appeal to more niche or smaller fan bases. For instance, VRML's most recent competition happened at a fairly large stadium, but at Arizona State University. So not necessarily the largest stadium in the United States, for example. So just to be clear, I don't foresee VR content reaching the point of popularity to overtake flat screen competitive gameplay anytime soon. However, when you start to think about the opportunities, maybe looking farther down the line of how VR could be incorporated into esports, the hardware certainly opens up possibilities for new types of athleticism and gameplay, considering that there has been growth in virtual sports like Zwift, and those virtual sports have been promoted by bodies like the Olympics. We can see that VR could actually be interesting in terms of engaging different parts of the body than most esports do. So rather than flat screen focusing on a computer or controller, you have experiences already existing at arenas like EVA, which you can find throughout most of Europe, as well as in the Middle East. And these arenas focus on multiplayer, in-person gameplay and shooters. And this is something that, again, just operates and promotes different types of physical gameplay and physical activity that might be found in traditional gaming. And then, when it comes to spectatorship, we also have some interesting signs of potential, if not widespread adoption. Particularly, actually, when you start to consider ball and sticks sports, there have been opportunities and platforms that focus on bringing users from home into stadiums to watch gameplay live. This is X Stadium, for example. This has been a long-standing promise of VR that through co-location and a heightened sense of presence, users can feel more like they are together in the same place. And of course, gathering virtually to watch games live is incredibly normal when it comes to esports or esports researchers for that matter. That's what we're doing. So it seems like a potent combination when it comes to combining that with immersive technologies. It's completely aspirational, but you can imagine that if you took thousands, if not millions of people who gather virtually on YouTube or Twitch to watch a game and instead could transport them to a virtual landscape, that would be quite fun. And it certainly motivated concepts like Dota's VR Hub, even though right now I'd say that's more of a fantasy than a reality. So our stance isn't to suggest that VR is a ubiquitous or even accessible technology, but to imagine that components of it could and probably will enhance and influence esports in the future. So we were interested specifically then in how esports has already been impacted by VR, and then we were also interested, that's our first research question, and then we were interested in how it could impact esports, particularly in terms of spectatorship, our second question. And to answer this, we took a multi-method approach. Our first question we answered through theoretical sampling and a case study, drawing information based on emerging theory. We did this primarily looking at Valve's effort in VR esports and then looking at a more ground up esports community. We derived that data by assembling information from journalism around the subject, but also supplementing that with online posts from community forums, mostly Steam and Reddit. And then for spectatorship, since numbers for VR spectatorship are relatively small, we decided to conduct an experiment instead. So I'll quickly dive into our case studies. And what's interesting here is when we look at Valve and we consider how they looked and integrated VR into esports, there has been a real tension between the potential opportunities for VR and esports and the difficulties of maintaining the device's usage. The most notable endorsement of specifically that VR and esports, again, VR is very much in the news with Steam as of yesterday. But when it comes to esports, the thing they've worked the most on has been this Dota 2 VR hub. And this was released in 2016, a few weeks, I believe, before one of the international tournaments. It was maintained for about a year. We found journalism that was covering how you could use it at the next year's tournament. And in that year, there was really a lot of significant fanfare from the press about the opportunities for spectators. Outlets from Polygon to Ars Technica praised the platform for a variety of reasons that really were aligning with the hype surrounding VR at that time, and particularly aligning with Valve's promotion of the HTC Vive, which was their flagship VR device. For instance, one article mentioned that the add-on was a gem of a free release. And Valve clearly wanted to up visibility of their new headsets, so they tied it to esports. They released a limited edition head strap to go with the international. And as we saw with that video that I showed earlier, it was very much fan directed. This wasn't something where you were playing esports, it was something where you were spectating. However, throughout the release, there were real issues with onboarding. You could find plenty of posts of people being confused as to how to actually get the application up and running. And really, after 2017, maintenance and instruction dropped. And soon those who wanted to use the VR experience simply couldn't figure out how to do it with the instructions provided. 2 years after that, so getting about 4 years after the initial release, there were posts basically discussing how the app crashed and was unusable, and that by the time those posts and articles were released, it was actually being called an embarrassment to Valve. So you can imagine that this was considered problematic and sort of aligned with people abandoning the use of VR and the crash of that hype cycle. What's also interesting, though, is along with those discussions of how Valve might be embarrassed about how it deployed the VR hub, there was also some conversation about Valve being using Dota 2 as a testing ground for ideas that could then languish. There were explicit comparisons to Dota 2 being the new Team Fortress 2, where similar experiments had occurred, and even April Fool's jokes about this phenomenon from some news outlets. But I actually think these accusations have some truth. It seems like Valve did push VR when it came to esports into the more experimental category. Valve, for instance, has not worked on explicitly integrating Counter-Strike into VR, but they have allowed for significant user-based mods and patches. There have been multiple attempts to do this, and when it comes to esports, the most played is Pavlov, which is a game directly built from Counter-Strike. And it's actually used, as you can see, in VRML's tournaments, and both the game and the tournaments have been fairly self-sustaining. They have a consistent structure, consistent tournaments, and a prize pool, even if that prize pool is relatively small, $20,000. So while not large, as you can see, there is this grounded community that keeps the game going. And we found something very similar when we looked at a more bottom-up esports surrounding VR content. I mentioned already that many of the early VR games have been niche, and perhaps none more so than hot dogs, horseshoes, and hand grenades. I can't see the chat right now, but I would be interested if anyone has played this game. It's also known as H3VR. The game has had its first official release after 7 years of early access. It is the largest game by the indie studio Rust Limited, and it has a very small team with CTO Anton Hand regularly communicating with fans. However, at one point in 2020, H3R was actually one of the best-selling games in VR on Steam, and it also has received quite good reviews even today for its gunplay, the fact that it is meant to mimic real life, not in terms of the avatars, which are in fact hot dogs, but in terms of bullet physics, reload, recoil, and the actual gun use of the game. So it sort of fits that promise of more physical movements that VR can allow. In terms of competitive gaming, the main tournament that where people compete is known as First to Verst, which had yearly competitions in 2020 through 2023. It took 2024 off and then has continued in 2025. They're reviewing comments about the tournament. There's really deep appreciation for the community-led maintenance of it, for conversations with Anton, who is very responsive with fans. There's a lot of community-led statistics. You can see someone analyzing through via Google Docs how the games went in 2025, and also an appreciation for keeping the game as it is, not constantly changing it, but rather keeping a kind of baseline going. And so, even though actually VR was not mentioned all that much in these posts, this briefcase does highlight the value and passion of such a small community when it comes to VR use. The actual competitions are relatively small. We're talking about in the hundreds, but it does still prove that self-sustaining communities exist around esports, especially because there can be deep connections between developers and athletes in terms of need. So just to summarize our experiment very briefly, we do have some interesting preliminary findings. To give you an overview of what we did, and I could go into more details about this during the Q&A, but we wanted to compare the viewing of an esports tournament in real life versus a VR experience. We set up a simple viewing with two participants in our lab, and then we also recreated that same experience in VR. Our measures represent classic VR and media psychology measures, specifically looking at embodiment, presence. We also draw measures from self-determination theory, and all our measures met statistically acceptable thresholds for alpha reliability, except relatedness, which was therefore dropped. And what we found is participants experienced decreases in most measured constructs after VR exposure. So those included word of mouth, spatial presence, and competence in game identification. Interestingly, social presence did increase. In the 2D condition, participants expressed increases across most constructs with spatial presence, agency, social presence, ownership, and change, all having strong effects, and the one exception being game identification decreasing. So this implies that the medium matters and that VR and 2D triggered opposite psychological processes, and also counterintuitively, 2D produced stronger spatial presence than VR. Um, Both conditions also enhance social presence, but through potentially different mechanisms. And we noted that there might be a practical concern in terms of VR's negative impact due to word of mouth and feelings about VR in general. We then did independent sample t-tests, and we found some slight differences. What we found were that VR participants started higher than 2D participants when it came to ownership, agency, body change, spatial presence, word of mouth, and autonomy. So given that, we had to rethink what we were considering, and what we found was that the VR conditions started with maybe higher baseline scores on most measures, whereas the 2D conditions started with lower baseline scores. And so that implies that the paired t-tests alone might have shown VR having a psychological outcomes that would be harmful, while 2D enhanced them. However, the independent sample t-tests revealed that both groups may have been converging towards similar endpoints, with VR decreasing from a higher starting point and 2D increasing from a lower standpoint. And so, just with a couple seconds left, what can we draw as results from this, clearly in terms of current impact, we can see that VR is still a niche modality and that it does have some promise in terms of relationship to virtual sports. At the same time, it also has the potential to sustain small communities of users that have niche interest in it. In this sense, I might compare it to smaller or low tier esports that have popularity, or what Matt Knutson, I believe, is referring to as esports at the periphery. We also see some potential positive associations with spectatorship in the lab. But looking into the future, I think we could imagine more holistically that VR and immersive media could have some potential to be a meaningful bridge between games and ball and stick sports, especially imagining XR or extended reality, which allows for interaction of virtual and non-virtual objects. There are opportunities for games to employ virtual sports techniques and modes in the real world and vice versa. Um, this is likely to appeal to a small audience, but it's already happening. For example, you can already play pickleball remotely with friends in the Apple Vision Pro. So there is some possibility there. And similarly, we could see that there might be growth when it comes to opportunities for immersive spectatorship. And these could have some positive results for fans as well. And with that, I want to thank you all very much. And I'm very happy to answer any questions. And I will stop sharing my screen now.
Excellent timing, Max. You're actually ahead of the game.
Yeah.
Can everyone still see and hear us all right? Let me check the Twitch chat. All right. There are a few questions for you in the chat. This one says, this is maybe a bit more in terms of coaching, but I wonder if there are applications for AR in terms of an augmented map and using that for strategy training. To me, it sounds like a potential use case that's phrased a little bit more as a comment than a question. But what are your thoughts on applications of AR in esports?
Well, I think that mostly I would suggest that we think of immersive media along a spectrum. And so VR is by far the most pervasive because it has about a 10-year-old lifespan in terms of its most recent wave, but absolutely AR could prove useful. And the idea of having levels of overlays that could be used either in terms of training or in terms of play, I think would be very normalized. I also would say from a purely technological point of view, that we could imagine that a lot of the interfaces that are developed in immersive media will make their way onto flat screens. That happened very publicly this year when you think about how the liquid glass user interface has been integrated into iPhones. So these are often immersive media can act as testing grounds for interfaces that hold more opportunities. So I definitely can see that being useful, and thinking about ways of co-locating and providing information in 3D environments via AR is certainly something that could be explored in the future.
And then a question that I would like to hear you talk a little bit more about. One of the things that I think of immediately when I think of VR are, of course, the risks of motion sickness, which we know tend to occur primarily for older players and for female identified players or users of VR. Can you speak a little bit to how VR might then integrate with esports culture in ways that could amp up some of its cultural issues?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a real danger there, a real danger in VR making esports culture more exclusionary. Though I think that the problem often comes down to technology or design issues. So, to answer that, so historically, VR has tended to be designed by and for a very exclusive audience. That audience has primarily been men. And as a consequence, many of the physical reactions that are reported by groups have to do with simple design choices. If a headset is modeled to be on someone who's a 6 foot tall man and you wear it and you are 5 feet tall, that causes nausea. It almost always will. So there's opportunities for inclusive design that, if they are brought into VR and gaming spaces, can be very promising. Also, the real other issue around VR has to do with occlusion, the idea that it cuts off the senses, and that's becoming very, very sort of antiquated, especially when you think about XR devices like the Vision Pro, or I believe even something like the upcoming Steam frames. So I think that there's a real opportunity to promote to promote VR and recognize that those technological changes should be put at the forefront. Otherwise, it could push these devices to a specific type of player.
Mhm. And actually, a similar question came in from Matt in the chat. In your eyes, do esports exacerbate any of the conventional obstacles for VR? And he mentions things like space requirements, motion sickness, depth perception, or haptics. And is any of this part of why you see better potential for spectatorship?
I mean, I think that there is just such a discrepancy between popular esports and VR. I've done research separate from this study looking at most popular VR genres. And for instance, MOBAs are wildly and strategy games are wildly unpopular in VR just because some of the things that you mentioned, but also that the controllers really aren't built for the tiny movements that are necessary for a strategy game. So I think that the most successful VR integration would recognize that physical movement is a necessity with VR, and promoting games that allow for that will also help solve some of those depth perception, haptics, and motion sickness issues. If you try H3 VR, which I do recommend, you'll notice that because you're using a physical gun that actually sort of feels like a gun and you have to load it, you're doing it a lot more slowly than you do if you're playing like Counter-Strike or Valorant or the equivalent. So it's a very different experience.
Excellent. And I don't see any other questions coming in. Matt says, thank you. So we will take a quick break and then we will move on to our next presenter starting at 3:30. Thank you, Max.
Thank you.